Yeah, and in particular it's about an objection to Lewis's contextualism that's been made sort of over and over again, which is that it's implausibly easy to induce skeptical context on Lewis's epistemic contextualism. And this is because of his rule of attention, which says that any not P possibility that's attended to in a context by the attributor of knowledge must be eliminated by the subject's evidence in order for that subject to count as knowing P in the context. And what I'm going to do is discuss the way that his followers tend to try to refute this objection, which is by scrapping the rule of attention. And I'm going to suggest that this isn't sufficient for overcoming the problem because another one of Lewis's rules has similar skeptical implications. And then if I have enough time, I'm going to suggest that a very similar skeptical worry arises for modal epistemologies more generally. And by modal epistemologies, I just mean any theory of knowledge on which whether a subject S knows P in the actual world depends on what's going on in other possible worlds. So here's my roadmap. Okay, so like I said, Lewis's contextualism is outlined in Elusive Knowledge, although there are hints towards it in his earlier work, in particular in Scorekeeping in a Language Game. And on Lewis's semantics for knows, it's true that a subject S knows that P in a context C if and only if P holds in every possibility left uneliminated by S's evidence. And Lewis is conceiving of evidence in a technical sense, very narrowly just as a subject's perceptual experiences and apparent memory in a context. And these are supposed to be non-factive. So if you're having a visual experience as of there being a daffodil in front of you, that doesn't entail that there is a daffodil, it just means that it seems to you that there's daffodil in front of you. And your evidence eliminates the possibility for Lewis when the possibility is one in which your counterpart doesn't have the evidence that you have in the actual world. And knows and its cognates are context sensitive, Lewis argues, because they inherit the context sensitivity of the quantifier every. So here's Lewis. If I say that every glass is empty, so it's time for another round, doubtless I and my audience are ignoring most of all the glasses there are in the whole wide world throughout all of time. They are outside of the domain, they are irrelevant to what was said. And so too for every not P possibility. I'm doubtless ignoring some of all of the uneliminated possibilities that there are. They are outside of the domain, they're irrelevant to the truth of what was said. But we can't just ignore any not P possibility we choose on Lewis's account. Rather, he posits a series of rules for determining whether a possibility is properly ignored in a context. So the first of these is the rule of actuality. The possibility that actually obtains is never properly ignored. And this rule is what ensures that knows is factive for Lewis. So a subject can't know the S if S is false, because this would require that S can't have the evidence she has in the actual world in some possibility in which not P holds, but the actual world is a possibility in which not P holds, and obviously S has the evidence she has in the actual world in the actual world, so you can't know that P if P is false. The next is his rule of belief. A possibility that the subject believes to obtain is never properly ignored, whether or not he is right to believe, and neither is one that he ought to believe, one that evidence and arguments justify him in believing, whether or not he does so believe. And third is his rule of resemblance. Suppose one possibility saliently resembles another, then if one of them may not be properly ignored, neither may the other. The rule of resemblance is what precludes knowledge of lottery propositions and in Gettier cases for Lewis. So I can't know that my lottery ticket is a loser in a fair lottery before the lottery is drawn, even if it is a loser, and this is like extremely likely on my evidence. Because there is a possibility in which my ticket wins that saliently resembles actuality in which some other ticket wins. And actuality can't be ignored by the rule of actuality, so if we apply these two rules in conjunction, I can't eliminate the possibility in which my ticket wins on my evidence. So I can't know that my ticket's a loser before the lottery is drawn. And I also can't know that there's a sheep in the field on the basis of visually perceiving a sheep-shaped rock behind which there is actually a sheep, because there is a world that saliently resembles actuality in which there's no sheep behind the rock, but this is exactly resembles actuality insofar as my belief is based on perception of the rock, and very closely resembles actuality insofar as far as I can see, there's only one sheep thing in the field. And then the last of his rules is the rule of attention. This is what Lewis says about it, it's quite long. When we say that a possibility is properly ignored, we mean exactly that. we don't mean that it could have been properly ignored. Accordingly, a possibility not ignored at all is ipso facto not properly ignored. What is and what is not being ignored is a feature of the particular conversational context. No matter how far-fetched a certain possibility may be, no matter how properly we might have ignored it in some other context, if in this context we are not in fact ignoring it but attending to it, then for us now it's a relevant alternative. And I've tried to put this a bit more succinctly. The rule of attention, which I'll henceforth call RA, any possibility that's attended to in the current conversational context is not properly ignored in that context. The rule of attention is the rule that does most of the work in explaining how nose shifts its content between contexts for Lewis. And this is the rule that does most of the work in explaining the kind of cases that are meant to motivate contextualism. So in an ordinary context, like down the pub, when I'm not considering like such far-fetched possibilities as that I'm a brain in a vat, I can count as knowing many things, including that I have hands. But when I start thinking about the possibility that I'm a brain in a vat when I'm in my epistemology classroom, this possibility becomes relevant by the rule of attention. And as my vat counterpart has the same evidence and apparent memories as I do on Lewis's account, but she falsely believes that she has hands, it's not the case that all uneliminated possibilities for me are ones in which I have hands, and so it's no longer the case that I know that I have hands. So a lot of people really don't like this rule. Lots of philosophers make similar objections to it, which is basically this is too easy to induce skeptical context. The skeptic can basically induce a skeptical context at will. So Michael Williams objects to the rule that as skeptical possibilities resist elimination by evidence on Lewis's explication, the rule ensures that a person's knowledge vanishes every time such a possibility enters his head. This isn't quite right, because it's not that knowledge, the thing in the world, or the mental state, or the combination of mental state, non-mental states, whatever you think knowledge is, that's not vanishing when we attend to skeptical context. What's happening is that a context is being induced in which most of our knowledge, or many of our knowledge attributions that would ordinarily be true, are coming out false. And as Jonathan Ichikawa says, to force a context in which nose does not apply is no more to destroy knowledge than to force a context in which everybody does not apply is to destroy everybody. This is actually Lewis's fault, because he does talk about epistemology destroys knowledge is like a direct quote. So he's being a bit messy, but we'll allow that. So Michael Bloom-Tillman puts the objection more carefully. He says that it isn't plausible that mere attention to skeptical possibilities ought to suffice for inducing skeptical context, and he gives this counterexample to motivate this, which I'm going to be calling sneaky son from now on. So imagine you saw your teenage son sneaking away through the window of his room late at night. When you confront him the next morning, he replies somewhat desperately, "How do you know I left the house? I mean, for all you know, you might have dreamt it. It was late at night, wasn't it?" And the rule of attention has it that your son bringing this possibility to your attention suffices for inducing a context in which this not P possibility is relevant and must be eliminated by your evidence in order for you to know that he sneaked out last night. But supposedly your evidence, your perceptual experiences and apparent memories, which aren't factive, remember, aren't enough to eliminate this possibility. Your dreaming counterpart has the same evidence. And so just by suggesting that you might have been asleep, your son has managed to make it the case that you don't count as knowing that he sneaked out. And Bloom-Tillman says about this, this is surely not just a pity, it's also rather mistaken. Of course, you know your son sneaked out last night. You saw him doing so. And so he diagnoses the problem thus. Though you're attending to the possibility that you only dreamt that your son sneaked out, you're not taking it seriously. And it's only those possibilities that we take seriously that ought to be able to undermine our knowledge claims in a context. This is the same diagnosis of these kinds of problems that Ichikawa reaches, but Ichikawa is skeptical about the project of formulating rules for proper ignoring, so I'm not going to be talking about him, but I'll say that he comes to the same conclusion. Okay, so Bloom-Tillman now is setting about the task of getting rid of the rule of attention and replacing it with one that can do the same work, but on which it's harder to induce a skeptical context at will. And he does this by giving this technical explication of what it is to take a possibility seriously, which borrows very heavily from Robert Stolnaker's work on pragmatic presuppositions. So on Bloom-Tillman's account, a possibility W is taken seriously in a context if and only if W is compatible with the speaker's pragmatic presuppositions in C. and S pragmatically presupposes P and C if and only if she's disposed to behave in her use of language as if she believed P to be part of the common ground in C. This is slightly different from Stolnaker's account of pragmatic presupposition because he just talks about believing P to be part of the common ground. We don't have to get into it, but the difference is it's only about a disposition to behave as if you believe. But the notion of common ground is lifted directly from Stolnaker. So P is part of the common ground in C if all members of a group of speakers accept that P, all believe that all accept that P, all believe that all accept that P, and so on. It's meant to be recursive. And from this, Bloom-Tillman offers the following rule of presupposition, which I'm going to be calling RP. If W is compatible with the speaker's pragmatic presuppositions in C, then W can't be ignored in C. So the idea is that this rule doesn't allow the skeptic to induce a skeptical context just by bringing up skeptical possibilities. So returning to Sneaky Son. Your son says, how do you know you weren't dreaming? You say, I wasn't dreaming. And this means that you're presupposing against the dreaming possibility. And so it isn't made relevant by the rule of presupposition. So the upshot is that even while you're attending to the possibility that you merely dreamt that your son sneaked out, it's not the case that this possibility is compatible with the speaker's pragmatic presuppositions, precisely because you presuppose against it. And so it's not the case that the dreaming possibility is made relevant, and you can carry on knowing that your son sneaked out last night without eliminating this possibility. So great. But there's a problem. I think that it's not quite so easy to avoid falling into skeptical worries under Lewis's contextualism as this. And this is because another one of Lewis's rules also seems to allow that what is salient in a context can play a role in determining what's properly ignored. So remember Lewis's rule of resemblance. Suppose one possibility saliently resembles another. Then if one of them may not be properly ignored, neither may the other. And I've tried to put this in the form of the other rules. If a possibility W is not properly ignored, then any possibility W star that saliently resembles W is not properly ignored either. And as Jonathan Ishikawa notes, the language of salience, it's the notion of salient resemblance that is at issue here, suggests that which resemblance relation is at issue is a matter of context. And in particular, we have some control over what's salient in a context. So if we go back to the Sneaky Son example, he says, how do you know you weren't dreaming? You say, I know I wasn't dreaming. And then he brings to your attention some way that the dreaming possibility resembles actuality. So for example, that you have the same bedtime in the dreaming possibility as you do in actuality. And by virtue of bearing this same bedtime resemblance relation to actuality, the dreaming possibility is saliently similar to actuality, which can't be properly ignored. And then it seems that on the rule of resemblance applied in conjunction with the rule of actuality, the dreaming possibility has been made relevant and you no longer count as knowing that your son sneaked out. So though it's not quite as easy to induce a skeptical context as it is under RA, you have to do a bit more work in that you can't just bring up a not P possibility, you also have to describe some way it resembles actuality. It also seems that this is implausibly easy. It's implausibly easy to induce a skeptical context. Yes, so I think Bloom-Tillman and also Lewis's other followers who try to overcome the problem just by scrapping RA aren't yet out of the woods with regards to the skeptical worry. I have just enough time to make my final sort of speculative claim, which is that I think this is a problem for modal epistemology more generally. So due to constraints of time, I'm just going to focus on safety and sensitivity, given in terms of counterfactual conditionals. But I think the lesson is more general. We can talk about that in the questions if you like. So safety is a constraint, a necessary conditional knowledge that says S knows that P only if S is belief that P is safe, which means S could not have easily come to hold a false belief. Sensitivity says S knows that P only if S's belief is sensitive. Only if had P been false, S would not have believed that P. And this is standardly cashed out in the literature in terms of the following counterfactual conditionals, where the box here is supposed to be, its domain is supposed to be the domain of closed worlds. So safety says, had it been the case that S believed that P, it would have been the case that P, with the box ranging over closed worlds. And sensitivity says that had it been the case that not P, it wouldn't have been the case that S believed that P. So on standard semantics for counterfactuals, a counterfactual conditional, if P were the case, then Q would be the case, is true at a world W if all the closest P worlds to W are Q worlds. So an instance of safety is true if in all the closest worlds in which S believes that P holds. And an instance of sensitivity is true if and only if in all the closest worlds in which not P, S doesn't believe that P. But counterfactuals seem to be sensitive to context as well. And this is something that Lewis himself notes in Counterfactual Dependence and Times Arrow. So here's Lewis. Counterfactuals are infected with vagueness, as everyone agrees. Different ways of partly resolving the vagueness are appropriate in different contexts. Remember the case of Caesar in Korea? Had he been in command, would he have used the atom bomb, or would he have used catapults? It's right to say either, though not to say both together. Each is true under a resolution of the vagueness appropriate to some contexts. And Ichikawa interprets Lewis as here endorsing a limited form of contextualism about counterfactuals, under which what notion of similarity is relevantly salient may change according to the conversational context. And therefore, whether a counterfactual sentence is true depends not only on the antecedent, the consequent, and the state of the world, but also upon the conversational context. Ichikawa then offers his own semantics for counterfactuals that are supposed to capture this context sensitivity, but that requires quite a radical departure from the standard semantics. And in a few recent papers, Karen Lewis has offered a very minimal departure from the standard semantics that can capture this context sensitivity. So on Karen Lewis's account, had P been the case, then Q would be the case, is true in a context C at a world W, if and only if all the closest P worlds to Q are W are Q worlds, and that's just the standard semantics. But then on Karen Lewis's account, closeness is a function not just of similarity to W, but also of relevance. And relevance, a world is relevant for Karen Lewis if it's under consideration in a conversational context. So here's Karen Lewis. Picturesquely speaking, relevance can take worlds that are among the most similar and move them further away, and can take worlds that are less similar, but not too dissimilar, and move them to the closest sphere. So the way that Karen Lewis is using the word relevance is like the way I've been using the word salient. So returning to Sneaky Sun, one last time. Your son, when he brings up the dreaming possibility, emphasizes that this resembles actuality insofar as your bedtime is the same in both these worlds. This is sufficient, perhaps, if we adopt this minimal form of contextualism about counterfactuals, for bringing the dreaming possibility into the realm of the closest worlds. And this means that your belief is neither safe nor sensitive. So it's not safe because it's not the case that in all the closest worlds in which you believe that P is true, because P is not true in the dreaming world. And it's not sensitive because it's not the case that had P been false, you wouldn't have believed that P, because P is false in the dreaming world, but you still believe that P. And so on both of these modal conditions for knowledge, you don't know that P anymore. I think there is some room for the safety or sensitivity theorists to push back, but I've not really got the time to talk about it, and also I think it's going to be extremely difficult for them. So I'd just like to conclude by saying that the problem of easy skeptical context I don't think is specific to Lewis or even to contextualism. Rather, because context sensitivity plays an important role in modal language generally, this problem is going to crop up for lots of modal epistemologies. So I think that what modal epistemologists like safety and sensitivity theorists need to do is get much clearer on what their semantics for closeness orderings or for making worlds relevant are. Otherwise, it looks like the skeptic is going to be able to manipulate the context sensitivity of modal language in a way that induces skeptical context pretty much at will. Okay, thank you very much.